It was my father's retirement party, the kind of grand evening reserved for men who'd built legacies. White tablecloths, expensive wine, colleagues who spoke in carefully curated phrases like pillar of integrity and decades of service. And I sat at the end of the long table like a footnote in someone else's story, nodding politely, applauding when expected, pretending I wasn't still nursing the bruise of his most recent insult, the one he'd slipped into conversation just hours before guests arrived. "Don't forget to keep things simple tonight. We don't need another one of your TED Talk speeches embarrassing the family." And I had smiled then, small and tight, because that was the unspoken agreement. I play quiet, he plays respected, the speeches started early, a neighbor spoke first, then a coworker, then my sister, all delivering a highlight reel of a man they adored, and then came his turn. My father stood with his scotch glass raised high, that smug glint in his eye that always meant something theatrical was coming, and I braced for the performance before he even opened his mouth. "Family," he began, "is what keeps us grounded. Unless you're mine." And the laughter that followed wasn't cruel, not yet. It was the kind of laughter people offer when they assume the punchline is harmless. But then he kept going. He talked about my brother's business acumen, my sister's social grace, my mother's patience, each with flowery language and warmth. And then he got to me, and of course, my youngest, my very own philosopher, he said, pausing for effect. Always full of ideas, theories, and dramatic monologues, none of which have quite made it to the real world yet. The room laughed again, but this time it burned because I saw it in their eyes. Some discomfort, some pity, but mostly amusement. Like my failures were family lore. Like I was the comic relief in a biography I never consented to be part of. And I swallowed hard, held my smile, waited for the speech to move on, but he wasn't. "You know," he continued, swirling his glass, "when she was a kid, she once told me she'd buy me a house when she grew up. Well, I'm still waiting." And the room broke into full laughter this time, louder than before, as if that line alone summed up my entire contribution to the evening, empty promises and naive ambition. I wanted to leave, wanted to scream, wanted to disappear, but I didn't, because there was one more part of the night left, the part he hadn't seen coming, the part I'd been waiting on in silence for weeks, the reading of the new estate documents. Because while he mocked me for dreams unrealized, he had no idea that the lawyer in the back of the room, the one he barely greeted, was here for me, not for revenge, for revelation. And, what was about to be said, would rewrite everything. The dinner plates had been cleared, the champagne glasses refilled, and the music softened just enough to make space for what my father called a few final words. And when he stood up again, full of scotch and self-assurance, I knew he believed the night was his. One last round of applause, one more nod to his legacy, and then fade to black with the dignity of a man who thought he'd controlled every narrative, every room, every version of history that bore his name. But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the final act wasn't his to deliver, not tonight, not anymore. He opened with gratitude, thanking friends, neighbors, colleagues, even the caterer, pausing only briefly at my name with a tight smile that said, "Still here," and then gestured casually toward the back of the room. "And apparently we have some legal housekeeping to take care of, new estate planning and whatnot," as if it were an afterthought, a minor detail, the punctuation at the end of his carefully written story. And then the lawyer stood, Riley late, 60s, quiet posture, navy tie, the kind of man who made you lean in to hear what he said, not because he whispered, but because every word was intentional, the way you might speak if you held the weight of someone else's truth in your mouth. "I won't take much of your time," he said, his voice even, formal but not cold. "But Mr. Harrington asked me here tonight to review a few updates made to his estate and trust agreements." My father blinked. Twice. He looked at Mr. Riley like he was misremembering something, like maybe this was a draft document that was never supposed to see light, or a procedural oversight that would get sorted quietly in some office, far away from toasts and relatives. "I'm sorry," my father said, half laughing. "I don't recall authorizing a public reading." Mr. Riley gave the slightest tilt of his head. "You asked for witnesses. This qualifies." The room quieted. Forks paused midair. Phones lowered. Even the children stopped fidgeting. Because something was happening, something sharp and unplanned, and for the first time all evening my father wasn't performing, he was listening. The lawyer continued. He began with the standard clauses: living will, power of attorney, property transfers, language familiar enough to lull the room into mild confusion but not alarm. And then he said my name, effective immediately. The beneficiary of the Harrington Charitable Trust has been reassigned. Pause. Deep breath. To Ms. Ava Harrington, in full. The silence hit like a dropped crystal glass. Beautiful, shattering, undeniable. My father's mouth opened, then closed, then opened again. But that trust was set up in my name. It still is, Mr. Riley replied. You created it. Ava will now oversee it. A whisper ran through the room. One of my uncles leaned forward. My mother stiffened. Brian, the golden child of the family, sat up straighter, suddenly unsure if his seat at the table meant what he thought it did. And I just sat there, spine straight, hands folded, heartbeat steady, like I'd trained for this moment in silence for years. Because for every moment I'd been overlooked. I'd been learning, because the lawyer standing before them wasn't just delivering an announcement, he was returning power to its rightful owner, and I wasn't even close to done. There was a moment, maybe 10 full seconds, when no one spoke, not even my father, who always had something clever to say, some quip to soften the blow or redirect the spotlight, but this time his words failed him, and the only sound in the room was the low hum of the ceiling fan and the soft clink of someone setting down a fork. Because what just happened wasn't a slip, it wasn't a clerical error, it was intentional, legal, and public. And the control he'd worn like a tailored suit his entire life had just unraveled at the seams. Mr. Riley didn't flinch, didn't smirk. He simply adjusted his glasses, flipped a page in the folder, and continued. Miss Harrington will also assume sole authority over the Harrington Foundation's disbursement approvals, effective immediately. The shift in energy was instant. My mother looked like she'd swallowed her breath. Brian's wife muttered something that sounded like, "Are you kidding me?" But I kept my gaze fixed ahead, not smug, not shaking, just still. Because I had waited too long, swallowed too much, smiled too often, and this wasn't vengeance, it was alignment. It was justice finding its seat. My father stood slowly, a measured rise like he was hoping to control the narrative again by sheer posture. Mr. Riley, he said, tone strained with forced civility, I don't believe this is appropriate for a family dinner. On the contrary, Riley said without raising his voice, this is precisely what was requested by you when you signed these revisions 3 months ago. The crowd murmured. Even the cousin who never paid attention perked up now. 3 months ago? He had signed it? My father looked like he'd aged 10 years in a single blink. That can't be right, he said, eyes darting around, searching for someone to corroborate a version of the truth that didn't exist. But Mr. Riley wasn't bluffing. He opened a second folder, revealing a scanned copy of my father's signature, dated, notarized, witnessed. I watched as he scanned the page, confusion clouding into panic, and I realized he didn't remember because, to him, it had just been a stack of papers, a formality, a signature scribbled between meetings he didn't really read, because who would dare revise something so foundational without his full awareness? Me, I would. Because I'd spent the last 2 years earning that trust, quietly serving as the assistant director of the foundation's day-to-day operations, drafting proposals, analyzing legal protections, preparing contingency plans in the event of health issues, succession shifts, and yes, conscious estate reform. I had brought those documents to Mr. Riley. I had asked for legal review, and after 6 months of evaluations, updates, and adjustments, I had convinced my father, without him even realizing it, that the best way to future-proof his empire was to give the responsibility to the one child who didn't crave the spotlight. He signed, I filed, he forgot, I didn't. And now the truth wasn't just spoken, it was legal, it was irreversible, and it was unfolding in front of the very people who once whispered that I was the dramatic one. The soft one, the one with all the ideas and none of the outcomes. And now I was the one holding the pen. He didn't sit back down right away. My father just stood there, stiff and exposed, his hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the edge of the table, eyes locked on the document like he could will it to change by staring harder, like if he read it enough times the words would soften, the truth would bend, the lines would blur into something that restored his power, because that's what he was used to. Control, command, compliance. And now, here, in the very room built to celebrate him, that control was slipping like sand through a clenched fist. And it was happening publicly, irrevocably, in front of every person who had once admired him, followed him, feared him. And not a single one of them stood to help. Not Brian, who had always been quick to defend him, to mirror his confidence, to wear his last name like a brand he didn't earn but still expected to profit from. Brian just sat there, half shrunk in his seat, hands folded like a schoolboy who'd just been caught cheating on a test, avoiding my eyes because he knew that whatever illusion of hierarchy we'd all been living under had just collapsed. Not my mother, who had once told me in hushed tones not to provoke my father, not to make things harder than they need to be. She didn't say a word, didn't offer a lifeline, didn't even look in his direction, because this was no longer a matter of opinion or decorum. This was reality crashing through the walls of denial, and she, more than anyone, understood what it meant to lose the script you'd spent decades perfecting. And then Mr. Riley, calm as a judge and twice as uncleared his throat, the sound slicing through the quiet like a gavel, and said, "And in the event that Miss Harrington declines her responsibilities, secondary authority shall be transferred to the board's independent legal appointee." And the weight of those words didn't need explanation because it was as clear as it was brutal. Brian was not next in line, not considered, not even mentioned in the fallback plan. And it wasn't a mistake, it was a message. Aunt Carolyn gasped. My cousin leaned forward like the script had flipped and they weren't sure what scene we were in anymore. The sound of silverware clinking on porcelain filled the air as someone nervously adjusted their setting. But me? I didn't move. Because this wasn't about retaliation. It was about redefining the axis on which the family rotated. They had spent years trying to mold me into something palatable, predictable, docile, telling me I was too much or not enough, depending on the day. Calling my ambition cute. My logic, cold. My dreams, unrealistic. But none of that mattered anymore because they had built a table assuming I'd always be grateful just to sit at the edge, and now they were realizing I'd built my own in silence. With discipline, with vision, my father looked at me, and for the first time since I was a child, I saw the absence of certainty in his eyes. Not anger, not disappointment, but fear. The hollow, disoriented kind that surfaces when a man realizes he's not the smartest person in the room, not the one calling the shots, not the legacy he thought he was passing down, because I wasn't his legacy, I was his replacement, not in name and principle. And when he opened his mouth, I could tell he wanted to say something, anything, maybe to save face, maybe to regain control. But Mr. Riley gently closed the folder with a quiet finality that said, "It's done." The room didn't applaud. It didn't need to because silence in that moment was louder than any ovation. He sat down slowly, like the air had thickened around him, like gravity had changed its terms. And for the first time in my life, I saw my father shrink. Not physically, but mythologically. The giant who once towered over dinner tables with booming laughter and thunderous opinions was now just a man with a suddenly fragile legacy, sitting at a long table surrounded by people who weren't sure if they were supposed to clap or look away, and the pause that followed wasn't a respectful silence. It was stunned stillness, like the moment after a glass shatters and no one dares to move in case the pieces cut deeper. I didn't gloat, didn't smirk, didn't shift in my chair or raise my eyebrows in triumph, because this wasn't about winning a moment. This was about reclaiming a truth. The applause never came because there was nothing performative left. Just facts on paper, authority reassigned, and decades of assumptions pulled out from under them like a rug they never thought I'd be strong enough to yank. Brian leaned in close to our mother, whispering something sharp, urgent. She shook her head, still wouldn't look at me. Still trying to hold on to some version of the story where this could be explained away as a misunderstanding, a clerical error, a cruel joke gone too far, but no one laughed. No one spoke. Even the servers lingered near the kitchen, sensing something seismic had just happened, something that would ripple long past the centerpieces and white wine refills. O'Reilly closed his folder, nodded to me once, a silent acknowledgement, not just of the paperwork, but of the courage it took to let the moment happen without interruption, without apology, because I had written that silence. I had designed it, and now they were sitting in it. "You okay?" Someone finally whispered from 2 seats over, a cousin I barely spoke to, eyes wide with something between respect and disbelief. I nodded once, didn't break, didn't blink, because I wasn't fragile. I was forged in years of being told to sit down, to be nice, to let the boys speak, to stop dreaming so big, to stop being so serious, so intense, so much. And now all of that intensity had focused itself into one clean, binding reality. I was the one in charge now. Not because I yelled the loudest, because I stayed the longest, studied the hardest, moved with strategy instead of spectacle. And now the same people who once dismissed me were recalculating everything they thought they knew about power. The room began to buzz again, quietly, awkwardly. Someone cleared their throat. Another person stood and made a weak joke about dessert. The party tried to continue, but it couldn't, because you can't go back to small talk when the air is still thick with revelation. My father raised his glass, barely, a limp gesture to salvage dignity, but even his toast felt like a requiem. "To family," he said, not quite looking at me. I didn't raise mine in return because we weren't drinking to the same thing. He kept glancing over like I might undo it all with a nod, like if I softened he could rewrite the narrative and file the night away as a misunderstanding, a fluke, a momentary lapse in control. But I didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't move. And that stillness, the very thing he used to mock me for, was now the loudest presence in the room. Because when you've been overlooked long enough, your silence doesn't read as weakness. It reads as warning. People were trying to act normal, like the night could be salvaged, like the charcuterie plates and floral centerpieces could absorb the weight of what had just happened. But no one knew what to say, not really. Not to me, not to him, because what do you say when the narrative breaks mid-sentence and the person you thought was the background becomes the author of the story? The lawyer had left, calm and composed, as if he had simply delivered a weather report, not detonated a generational hierarchy in the middle of a catered dinner, and I almost admired him for it. The professionalism, the quiet power of paperwork that doesn't shout but never wavers. Brian eventually stood up, muttered something about needing air, but we all knew it wasn't the air he needed, it was an exit. A place to hide from the reality that the family name he'd coasted on didn't buy him a seat at this new table, because in this version of the story, entitlement didn't matter. Results did, and I had delivered them, not for applause, for change. My aunt came up to me, later, awkward and fluttery, like a moth drawn to something too bright, and she tried to wrap it in a compliment. "I always knew you were smart." But the words fell flat, too little, too late, and I just smiled politely. Because I wasn't angry anymore, I was elevated. And people confuse the two, because they don't know what it looks like when a woman stops needing their approval. My mother eventually approached too, lips pressed so tightly together they looked like punctuation, and she stood there for a beat too long before saying, "I didn't know." And I believed her, but I also didn't care, because knowing had never been the problem. It was choosing not to look that stung the most. I didn't ask for forgiveness, didn't offer reassurance. She looked at me the way someone looks at a stranger they thought they understood, and in a way, she did understand now, finally, that I had built something stronger than permission, position. The event ended without ceremony, no speeches, no cake. Just people quietly collecting coats, glancing back at the room like they were leaving the scene of a truth they weren't ready to witness. And as I stood by the door, thanking guests with poise and calm, I realized this was the real inheritance. Not money, not property, not some dusty old trust fund, but control over the narrative they once tried to write me out of. The guests were gone, the catering staff packing up quietly, white linen folded over silver trays like a final curtain, and for a few moments it was just us. My father, still seated at the far end of the table, a half-full glass in his hand, staring into it like it might offer answers or at least an escape, but the only thing it reflected back was the truth. The night had ended, and he hadn't won, hadn't controlled the moment, hadn't rewritten the outcome with charm or force or volume, and now all that remained was the sound of his pride caving in on itself. I moved to leave, not for dramatics, not for effect, just because I was done. But then he spoke. Voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, like gravel underfoot instead of thunder in the sky. "I don't understand how this happened." He didn't ask why, didn't ask what, he asked how. Because in his world, consequences were supposed to be preventable, predictable, juxtaposed. And I paused, not out of obligation but curiosity, because I wanted to see if he could face what he'd never acknowledged, that the reason he didn't see this coming was because he never saw me. I turned back, kept my voice even. "You signed it." He shook his head, not in denial but in disbelief. "I trusted you." And I let the words sit. Because that was the irony, wasn't it? He had trusted me with everything, logistics, finances, legal prep, strategy. Trusted me because I was dependable, smart, precise, and invisible. He trusted me because he didn't see me as a threat. He trusted me because he assumed I'd never act De Bevel, lead, De Bevel, decide. And he was right, until he was wrong. I made you part of this family's future, he said, a little louder now, bitterness creeping back into his voice, like volume might rebuild the control he'd lost. I tilted my head, measured the weight of the moment, then replied, "No, you made me part of the decor. I made myself part of the foundation." His jaw clenched, but there was no rebuttal. Because deep down he knew. He had crafted legacies like stage sets, glossy, curated, brittle, and I had quietly been reinforcing them from behind the curtain, beam by beam, until I realized I didn't want to hold up a structure I couldn't shape. So I built my own. "You blindsided me," he said finally, and I nodded. "Maybe. Or maybe you just refused to read the script when someone else was holding the pen." He looked away. And I knew, in that moment, this wasn't a reckoning, it was a resignation. Not mine, his. The legacy he thought he could choreograph had shifted. The control he thought he'd pass down like an heirloom had already been rerouted. I didn't need to explain more, didn't need to offer closure because the story had already been told. And I wasn't a character in his version anymore. I was the author of mine. 3 weeks later, I stood in the Foundation's new conference room, glass walls catching the morning light like truth-catching breath, clean lines that didn't whisper legacy but declared transparency, framed community grant awards instead of oil portraits of men who mistook dominance for vision. And I watched a young intern, maybe 21, maybe younger, pin a budget proposal to the whiteboard with the kind of careful pride I recognized not from the world they used to praise, but from the one I had to build with my own 2 hands. And it struck me, not like lightning, not sudden or jarring, but like a slow sun rising through fog, that I hadn't just inherited control, I'd dismantled it, rewired it, stripped it of its performative scaffolding, and rebuilt it with the raw, real weight of intention. Because what I was building now wasn't a throne. It was a structure, a platform, a living blueprint that didn't need a nameplate or a gold plaque to be powerful. It just needed truth, the kind that endures long after the applause dies down, the kind that holds its shape when no one is looking. Because the future of this place, of this work, of this legacy, would not be stitched together with tradition and ego, but with alignment and equity and the quiet, relentless strength of people who had been told their whole lives they were too much with a room while being asked to hold it up anyway. And now? Now we were designing rooms where no one had to shrink to belong. The whiteboard filled with notes, ideas, frameworks. Not buzzwords, not optics, but real strategy, real reform, and I sat at the table, not as the exception, not as the token daughter or diversity line item, but as the decision maker, the one whose name wasn't passed down but earned, pixel by pixel, clause by clause, truth by truth. And when the news broke, first in local nonprofit circles, then in leadership newsletters, then inevitably in the family group chat I hadn't read since they tried to erase me with polite silence and backhanded smiles, it didn't make waves. It made direction, whispers in the right places, questions in others. Until my phone buzzed. Unfamiliar number, simple message. "You made it real. You made it yours. I'm proud of you." Claire, my cousin, the quiet one at dinners, the one who never spoke up when my father laughed at me across the table, but who always met my eyes, who always stayed 10 seconds longer when no one else noticed I'd stopped smiling. And suddenly I understood. This wasn't about reclaiming a seat at the table. It was about building a new one. Wider, stronger, unfolding not just for me, but for the Claires of the world, the ones who had been watching, waiting, wondering if their silence could ever find a home inside something that finally spoke for them, not over them. At night, I poured a glass of wine at home, lit the candle my mother once called too loud for the entryway, and pulled out the final copy of the will revisions. Not because I needed to see my name again, but because I wanted to feel what it meant to hold proof. Not just in the legal sense, but in the existential one, proof that I was never emotional. I was discerning, Havel too intense. I was exacting, rebellious, not enough. I was everything they couldn't control, and that's why they tried to discredit me. My name wasn't just there for inheritance, it was there for permanence. And I didn't feel vindicated, I felt anchored. Because this wasn't about winning anymore, this was about becoming. My father hadn't called not since the dinner, not since the papers, not since the silence swallowed his story and replaced it with mine. And I didn't expect him to, because some men would rather choke on their pride than speak into a truth they didn't write, and that's okay. I wasn't waiting for permission. I wasn't waiting for closure. I was building a future, one they would have to watch from the outside if they chose not to grow with it. And in that future, legacy wouldn't be measured by titles or applause or perfectly polished speeches. It would be measured by what you leave standing when no one's watching, by what you raise when others are still tearing down, by how many doors you build after they've spent years locking you out. Let them toast to tradition. I'll toast to transformation. And if you're still reading this, still carrying the weight of silence, still wondering when it's your turn to stand, let me tell you something simple and true. You don't need the keys to their room when you've already drawn up plans for your own. And when the world finally listens, it won't be to the ones who mocked you. It'll be to the ones who made the truth undeniable and signed their name to the new beginning.